As we continue on in our study of Til and Idealism, let's turn our attention now to Kant and Transcendental Idealism, Kantian idealism. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, is the true crossroads in the history of modern Western philosophy. Hume died in 1776. Kant in 1781 published his magnum opus, The Critique of Pure Reason. And he said it was in reading David Hume that he was awakened from his dogmatic slumber, possibly the most famous line in Kant's corpus. Now, there is a massive swatch of literature on the philosophy of Kant. So in the nature of the case, I have to be selective in my presentation, tethering the exposition of Kant to the thesis that Van Til rejected idealism in all of its post-Enlightenment expressions: subjective, Berkeley, transcendental, Kant, and absolute, Hegel. This means that in the nature of the case, we cannot make this lecture a comprehensive study on Kant's philosophy. But what I want to do here is focus on the precise sense in which Kant himself spoke of his philosophy as a Copernican revolution. You must get that centered in your mind. Kant spoke of his theology, of his philosophy, his epistemology especially, as a Copernican revolution in terms of how minds relate to objects, of how mind relates to objects in the process of knowing. Now, as background, let me give you this, and let me cite up front my dependence on the work of W.T. Jones and his History of Western Philosophy. I'm doing this partly to pay tribute to the penetrating lectures of Dr. Greg Bahnsen, under whom I studied in the early 90s. And Bahnsen used Jones as the organizing core of his wonderful presentation of the History of Western Philosophy, which I commend for your study, both Bahnsen and Jones. The continental rationalist tradition sought certainty in a priori principles and their implications, in principles known apart from experience and confirmed by all experience. Cartesian rationalism ended in an ultimate dualism between mind and body, immaterial and material, facets of reality. Leibnizian rationalism ended with an ultimate pluralism with self-conscious centers of monads constituting what is real. Spinoza, in his form of rationalism, ended with an ultimate monism, with his assertion that there is only one infinite substance, which he called God. And so the continental rationalist tradition, seeking absolute certainty, ended in dualism with Descartes, pluralism with Leibniz, monism with Spinoza. That is quite embarrassing for those committed to finding absolute certainty and truth through a priori principles of reasoning and their implications. But the British empiricists sought probable knowledge in a posteriori principles and their implications. They wanted to tether all knowledge to what can be gained from sensible particulars. But David Hume demonstrated, and I think he did this well on consistent empiricist principles supplied by Locke and others, that the concepts of causality, personal identity, and substance cannot be rationally vindicated on strict empirical principles. That is, they cannot be rationally verified by observation, but he said instead, the concepts of causality, personal identity, and substance are mental habits. They are supplied by the mind in the absence of empirical observation. But in the process, Hume's empiricism destroyed any hope of knowing an external world and gaining certainty about it, as he reduced beliefs as basic as causality, personal identity, and substance to mental habits. Now, the rationalists then and the empiricists supply a context for understanding what Kant is going to say about his Copernican revolution in philosophy. And I gave that to you in order to frame Kant. While rationalists sought knowledge in a priori principles that are brought to bear on experience, and while empiricists sought knowledge from a posteriori categories contained in experience itself, they both held a common belief. Now, please hear this. They both believed that minds discover and conform to objects in the external world. Descartes and Locke, Leibniz and Hume, no matter their differences, understood the mind to be a passive receiver of external objects. Locke famously construed the mind as a tabula rasa, on which experience received on which the mind received impressions from objects. So the mind, for Locke, for instance, is a blank slate, and it passively receives the impressions upon it, much like an old-fashioned typewriter key would make an impression on a piece of typing paper. If you're my age, you understand that. If not, Google that. But an external object strikes a piece of paper, leaves an impression on it. That's Locke's conception of how minds relate to external objects. Now, Kant responded to these quandaries with a basic twofold thesis. That we're going to see he calls the Copernican revolution. Here's point one. Kant argued that the mind, the understanding, is not passive and receptive, but active and constructive. Second, the central constructive role of the mind consists in forming the intelligibility of objects in terms of transcendental categories. And the mind, more specifically, constructs objects in space and time, the Transcendental Aesthetic, and in rationally necessary categories, the Transcendental Analytic. And so these 2 points are going to define the fundamental contours of what Kant, we'll see here in a moment, is going to call the Copernican revolution. The mind is active and constructive, point one, and it constitutes the appearance of objects in terms of space and time, the Transcendental Aesthetic, and in terms of rationally intelligible categories, the Transcendental Analytic. And so the mind supplies the synthetic dimension of knowable objects in experience. And the mind imposes analytical order on those objects made intelligible. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. In this Copernican revolution, we're going to talk first, number one, about the constructive function of understanding, of human understanding, of the mind in relation to objects. So that the mind is going to impose or construct the intelligibility of objects. This is going to be fundamental to his idealism. Kant denied that the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate on which experience writes. And he says this in the Critique of Pure Reason. He says, hitherto, it has been assumed that all of our knowledge must conform to objects. But all attempts to extend our objects of knowledge by establishing something in regard to them a priori by means of concepts has ended in failure. Let me make a short pause on that. He's talking about Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. All started with a priori principles, first principles, and all ended in different conclusions. Going on. He says, we must therefore make a trial whether we may not have more success in the task of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. So, as the mind imposes or constructs the intelligibility of experience, objects now are said to conform to the mind. The mind is imposing order on the objects, and the objects, therefore, are conformed to knowledge, to understanding. Now, this states the debate between realism and idealism crisply, at least the realism and idealism that Kant was engaging. The realist position is that minds conform to objects. The emerging idealist position is that objects conform to minds. Now, please remember this. Kant's proposal is that objects outside of the mind exist. But while they do exist, they are conformed to the categories of understanding and not intrinsically intelligible. They are not intelligible in themselves, but must be made intelligible by the various operation of human understanding. So according to Kant, the mind actively shapes objects to conform to its structures of time and space, and actively imposes the analytic categories of intelligibility upon them. Objects, he says, must conform to knowledge, and this he calls the Copernican revolution. Understanding, then, please hear this before we move on. Understanding is a dynamic structure, a dynamic function that conforms objects to the mind, to the categories in the mind. The mind makes this constructive contribution to knowledge. Objects must conform to the active, organizing categories supplied by the knowing mind. And apart from this constructive operation of understanding of the mind, we would have no ordered, rational understanding of objects in space and time. Greg Bahnsen, in his lectures on Kant, said that for Kant, the mind takes what is chaotic and loose and makes organized cubes of knowledge. And he uses that wonderful ice tray analogy, that the mind takes the loose and chaotic water, as it were, and forms it into intelligible cubes for rational apprehension. But here's the point I want you to get first. The Copernican character of the Kantian proposal is that the understanding is constructive and therefore imposes spatial, temporal, and rational intelligibility, categories of intelligibility, onto objects that then are said to conform to the mind. That's point one. That is the Copernican revolution. That is Kant's constructivist view of understanding. Now, secondly, and I want to talk a little bit more about this relationship between mind and object. So this is the same thing, except now I'm going to talk about how the objects are constituted as intelligible by the mind. So this isn't a separate chart. This is just an extension of what we've begun with here. Point one, the constructive. Point two, we're going to look at the transcendentals of understanding. The transcendental critiques. The transcendentals. How does the mind form objects intelligibly? Well, there are two fundamental movements that I'm going to talk about. And in so doing, I'm going to make a diagram here of how the mind is relating to the object. The first movement of the mind, according to Kant, is to form one of two categories upon experience. And I guess before I tell you what the precise features are, let me remind you of this. Kant affirmed sensation and understanding as the two sources of knowledge. The British empiricists began with sensation or objects in experience, and perceptions involve receiving impressions on the blank slate of the mind from objects in experience. Sensation provides the empirical data that the empiricist claims the mind receives passively. The continental rationalists began with categories of understanding, a priori categories, categories that precede experience and conform all experience to it. The a priori structures or concepts organize perceptions, and perceptions don't exist apart from those organizing structures. Kant agreed that there are two sources of knowledge, sensation and understanding. But he construes this relation differently than either the empiricists or the rationalists. Here's what he argues. The next facet of his Copernican move is to insist that subjects and objects, minds and their content, do not exist apart from one another at any point, so that understanding begins with both concepts and percepts in a mutually conditioning relation. He says, concepts without percepts are empty. He says, percepts without concepts are blind. He says, contrary to the British empiricists, he says you have to have more than bare objects of sensation. But he says, contra rationalism, you have to have more than empty concepts. If you try to use concepts not rooted in human experience, you engage in empty, vain speculation. If you try to use percepts without concepts, you have loose and disjointed instances of experience. You're blind. And so please hear that. Listen and understand this. Kant is saying that if you use a priori concepts not rooted in and organically related to experience, you will engage in empty, vain speculation. Concepts without percepts are empty. And what did that empty speculation result in? Cartesian dualism, Leibnizian pluralism, Spinozan monism. But if you try percepts without concepts, and you have only loose and disjointed perceptions, you are going to reach the blind alley of Humean skepticism. So Kant, the second main feature of the Copernican revolution, Kant argued, secondly, for the integrated function of concepts and percepts. They are not artificially segregated from one another. They are not separated from one another. They are functionally inseparable. And so, Kant raises the question, how is it that concepts and perceptions are integrated functionally in every noetic act? Well, it's here that he introduces the idea of the transcendentals, the Transcendental Critiques. And the first thing that he says, I'll put it right here. Let's see here. Just going to erase what I had there. We're going to talk about two fundamental operations of the mind on objects. The first is the Transcendental Aesthetic. The second is going to be the Transcendental Analytic. And I want to explain both of these as they bear on the world of perceived objects. So make sure that this is clear in your mind as you're processing this information. The mind is imposing order, imposing space-time order, logical order on the objects of experience, constructively, so that concepts and percepts are inseparably related. The question is, how are they inseparably related? How does the mind organize perceptions? Well, first is the Transcendental Aesthetic. In this section, Kant, of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant asks, under what conditions is it possible to experience the objective world? And he answers that in this section called the Transcendental Aesthetic. And aesthetic here is used with reference to sensation, not beauty. You would think by aesthetic he means beauty, but he doesn't. He means the transcendentals of sensation. And he asks what initial categories are required in order to make sense experience intelligible. Well, he argues in the Transcendental Aesthetic that all objects are constituted, and this is going to look a little artificial. Maybe there's a better way to diagram it, and I'll try to show you what I'm after here, but he says objects are constructed by the mind in terms of space and in terms of time. And these categories are going to be mutually conditioning. You could, if you wanted to be a little more technical, you could say spatio-temporal. So I'll put that up too if you like that. Spatio-temporal, with the hyphen representing the interdependence of space and time as inseparably related in knowing any object. But in the Transcendental Aesthetic, the first, or we could just call it this, the first logically primal operation of the mind, conforming sensations to its structures, is a spatiotemporal act. Kant says, quote, and if you're wanting to find that this one is quoted in W.T. Jones, the other was quoted from the a portion that I don't believe is in Jones. Quote, space, now listen to this, space, Kant says, is not an empirical concept that has been derived from outer experience. For in order that certain sensations might be referred to something outside of me, the representation of space must be presupposed. Space must be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances and not as a determination dependent on them. Space is not a general concept of relations of things in general, but a pure intuition. It follows that an a priori and not empirical intuition underlies all concepts of space. Now that, from page 32 of W.T. Jones, is a hold the press moment in terms of the Copernican revolution. Kant is saying, and I'll expound this a little bit more, space is not an empirical conception. It is a pure, rational intuition. This means that we should not conceive of space as something existing outside of the mind, but itself, space itself, an intuition of the understanding. Let me put it a little differently. Space is an a priori structure of understanding, a pure intuition that the active understanding imposes as the condition for the possibility of knowing objects. Space, then, is an a priori intuition supplied by the understanding that renders objects intelligible. But W.T. Jones argues, I'll give you a quote here, that the Transcendental Aesthetic also contains an exposition of time, which can be treated more briefly because it is largely parallel to the exposition of space. According to Kant, time, like space, is a pure form of intuition, that is, a mode of ordering that is immediate and sensuous, just as our minds order our experience spatially as being above or below, to the right or left, or of other experiences, so they order these experiences temporally as being before, after, simultaneous with other experiences. And so here, the space above, below, is also and invariably accompanied by a before and after. Before, after, time, above, below, left or right, space. And the point that Kant makes is that these are mutually interdependent, conjoint intuitions by which objects of experience are rendered initially intelligible. The categories of space and time are actively supplied by the understanding, and so once again, objects are conforming to minds. And the way that they are brought to conform to mind is through the initial operation of the mind in the Transcendental Aesthetic, whereby the pure intuitions of space and time form the intelligibility of objects for experience. Space and time are not extramental, empirical realities that stand or hover outside of understanding. Space is an a priori intuition supplied by the understanding, and time is an a priori intuition supplied by the understanding. Now, just in light of this, we see the initial propension of the Copernican revolution. The constructive understanding that integrates concepts and percepts imposes on all objects of experience the pure intuitions of space and time, so that objects conform to the spatiotemporal intuitions of understanding. This is the first main structural step in the transcendentals of human experience. And it is the first clear expression of an idealist thesis that objects must conform to the active spatiotemporal structures of the mind. Now, the second aspect of the critique is the Transcendental Analytic. The second primal operation of the active understanding is the imposition of analytic categories onto space-time objects of perception. The analytic deals now not with the constitution of objects in space and time, but with the specific concepts that structure our space-time experience. And so the Transcendental Analytic, instead of being spatiotemporal, is fundamentally conceptual. Now, that doesn't mean space and time lack conceptual content, but I think we could say something like this: they are analytically conceptual, the Transcendental Analytic. The analytic deals with 12 categories that the mind imposes upon the intuitions of objects in space and time. Now, I'm not going to put them all up because there's no need to do that for our purpose. But what I want you to recognize, and I'll just use 4. I think I'll go with 4. You can say that of the 12 categories, probably the most easy to grasp ones are quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Quantity, quality, relation, and modality. I could do a more sophisticated 12-cubed ice tray approach, but we don't need it. One of the examples of relation, for instance, is cause and effect. A subset of a relational category is cause and effect. Causality. Kant argues that the mind adds constructively causal relations to your perceptions of objects in time and space. The genius of Kant's response to Hume is that he not only agrees with Hume's constructive thesis about the mind imposing the concept of causality, but for Kant, experience, perceptions, is made intelligible by concepts, causality, as the two are concretely joined in understanding. The genius of Kant's critique of Hume is that he integrates concepts and percepts through the Transcendental Aesthetic and Transcendental Analytic, so that as the mind structures experience, it's structuring space-time objects. Concepts without percepts are blind. Percepts without concepts are empty. And the mind supplies this interdependent relation between concepts and percepts so that the mind gains understanding of sensible objects in organic relation to rational concepts. And so percepts are made intelligible in terms of time and space. Concepts are structured in terms of the 12 categories of experience. And we don't begin with percepts isolated from concepts or concepts isolated from percepts. We don't end up with an ultimate dualism like Descartes, an ultimate monism like Spinoza, an ultimate pluralism like Leibniz. We don't end up with a tabula rasa and skepticism as we do with Hume. Kant's dictum, Kant's constructivist philosophy, concepts without percepts are empty, percepts without concepts are blind. He brings conceptual and perceptual features of reality together and ascribes a constructive activity to the understanding in this Transcendental Aesthetic and Transcendental Analytic. And in this way, he believes he is saving philosophy from the abstraction of the continental rationalists and from the skepticism of the British empiricists in Hume. But now let me make this one last point that you need to understand in order to grasp Kant. We could talk, and I'm just going to tease this out briefly, of a transcendental dialectic, of a dialectic that occurs if you try to apply space and time categories, quantity, quality, relation, and modality to things beyond objects in experience. If you seek to apply the categories of understanding, the Transcendental Aesthetic, the Transcendental Analytic, if you seek to apply these to metaphysical matters, God, freedom, things in themselves, you wind up, according to Kant, in hopeless contradiction. Now, I'm not going to probe this too much, but Kant believed, please hear this, Kant believed that the theistic proofs cannot, in the nature of the case, have absolute probative force in demonstrating the existence of God. The proofs, he argues, are inherently indeterminate. The proofs, he says, can lead to contradicting conclusions. They can prove God is eternal or temporal, necessary or contingent, simple or composite. And one of the main reasons for this is, for Kant, the understanding and what Kant termed here, to use one large category for this, theoretical reason. Theoretical reason cannot be applied to anything beyond appearances. There is, for Kant, no application of theoretical reason, no application of the transcendental categories of the understanding to metaphysical issues. Listen, you cannot know God by virtue of theoretical reason at all. Theoretical reason has been restricted to phenomena, to appearances. Now, this implies something that I'm going to develop soon. For Kant, understanding, the active understanding, is not confronted in its initial operations with the revelation of God. For Kant, there can be no revelation of God in phenomena. Why? Because phenomena is regulated by understanding, by the active constructive mind, by the Transcendental Aesthetic and the Transcendental Analytic. The mind knows space-time objects. The mind knows space-time objects in terms of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. But the mind, understood in terms of theoretical reason, according to the transcendentals that render objects intelligible, does not know God. Let me put it in language that, if you've had the previous modules, is going to click instantly. For Kant, there is no sensus divinitatis. There is no naturally implanted knowledge of God. To appeal to the previous opening lecture in this module, there is no atmosphere of revelation, and the mind of man, the mind that knows objects, is not inherently revelational of God. So for Kant, knowledge of God must be pursued by an alternative access to God he calls practical reason. Not theoretical, but practical. And so much could be said of this, but let me just say this tersely. Practical reason is knowledge of an ethical sort, but not a rational sort as defined by theoretical reason. Kant proposed that God must be known by a means other than theoretical reason, natural reason, because all natural or theoretical reason can grasp are objects constituted by the intuitions of the understanding. Transcendental Aesthetic and the Transcendental Analytic. All theoretical reason can yield is appearances of objects constituted by the activity of understanding. Now, with these remedial and foundational observations in view, we have now before us at least the fundamentals of Kant's proposal, and we can start to begin to probe Van Til's critique of Kant's so-called Copernican revolution, Kant's constructivist view of the understanding, and Kant's denial that theoretical reason can know God given the Transcendental Aesthetic and the Transcendental Analytic, which Van Til says ascribes legislative authority to the mind operating in an atmosphere devoid of revelation from God.